I just wanted to say that I'm not going to talk about the book I wrote, which is a sort of general contextualization of the movement. I just wanted to show very briefly the database that my colleagues and I are working on, which is an attempt to collect a protest event database of the Russian protests that started in December 2011, which also includes the actual sources used and is mostly based on primary material, so eyewitness accounts, bloggers, etc., rather than just media accounts. And just to give you a glimpse of what it looks like, here's a screenshot from the current version. So the way it works is that we have the slogans from every single event, and there's a you can also search for a slogan across place and time, and you can click directly on the photographs and the other sources that we use. So if you're interested in anything related to the database, I'll be happy to answer questions. But I want to talk about something completely different today, and ask for your help in developing an idea that is only briefly discussed in the book. So a prominent feature of the most recent wave of mass protests in the world is that they seem to be not so much about voicing specific demands than about occupying urban space. And we've discussed this several times today. So this is particularly evident in Russia, and we can see this in our database because relatively few, actually extremely few of the slogans in our database are demands, be it either for political or social transformation or for identity recognition. Most of them are much more easily understood as just expressions of affect. And what's more, the vast majority of demonstrations and even of the protest camps in Russia lack the kind of horizontal internal organization that has been singled out as one of the most prominent features of the new protests, for example, in Latin America. So a lot of people who work on Argentina, for example, talk a lot about horizontalidad, which is about people coming together in one space and kind of organizing that space democratically, almost in an anarchic fashion, without any leaders, and sort of coming together and feeding each other and organizing assemblies to discuss the issues at hand, etc. And that's something that we've been seeing actually relatively little of in the Russian case. And that's something that a lot of protest participants will mention in interviews. So for example, someone I interviewed who's very active in the Moscow protest says this energy, this is a quote, this energy is not ready yet. It hasn't been self-organized. People aren't self-organized. They can't find an issue for this energy, and the demonstrations don't channel it. So the question then is, what is the point of occupying space? If it's not to voice demands, be it only for group recognition, and if it's not primarily to create some sort of horizontal organization. As you know, some of the biggest demonstrations, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, were essentially people up on a stage in front of a large audience, and very little kind of horizontal self-organization among the mass of people who were first marching, and then many of them assemble in front of that stage. So it's still a very vertical kind of spatial organization. So I want to argue that there are two very important aspects here that may seem obvious, but which are usually bracketed out from empirical studies of social movements, namely the cognitive and the emotional dimension of protest. So before discussing the Russian case in particular, let me stress that these two aspects to me are not completely separate. They don't just happen to coincide. And in fact, the interdisciplinary study of emotions has increasingly come to abandon the formerly strict division between rationality and cognition on the one hand and affect on the other. So reflecting advances in neuroscience, historians of emotion such as Jan Plamper have begun to speak of cogmotive decisions. And the social psychologist Steve Riker, in his works on crowds and group dynamics, shows that the emotionality of crowds does not reflect their irrationality and malleability as earlier authors such as Le Bon and Chachotian would have it, but is actually intimately connected with their rationality and their agency. So to put it bluntly, agency feels good. Or as Riker phrases it, the emotion of crowds is tied to the enactment of reason, not its suppression. And I would add to this that cognition also feels good. More specifically, cognition becomes all the more important the more atomized a society and a movement feel to their members. Because they feel disconnected not just from society, but also from knowledge about that society. And examples, of course, are not hard to come by. So in the Russian context, we could start with the many new research initiatives that were started during and by the mass protests in December 2011, and whose members are present here. So we have the Folklore of the Snow Revolution group, which collects photographs and protest paraphernalia from a sort of ethnographic point of view. We have the Independent Initiative for the Study of Protests, Meetinghof, which is a collective that includes both professional researchers and sort of amateur colleagues. We have the Collective for the Study of Politicization, which has now become the PS Lab. We have our own PEPS team, and many more initiatives like that, both on a national and especially on a local and regional level. So what's important about all these initiatives is that they were created by the demonstrations. Often enough, they were created at the demonstrations. Members actually met inside the space of the demonstrations itself. And almost always they involve at least some people with no previous experience of movement research or even of research in the social sciences in general. And this, of course, is not a new development. We could say that every previous wave of mobilization has given rise to similar groups in the Russian context, but not only, some of which were later institutionalized. So one could mention the Panorama and Sova think tanks in Moscow, which grew out of the informal movement of the Perestroika, or the Institute for Collective Action, which is represented here by Karine Clément. So what's important to me is that this cognitive impulse is not restricted to academic researchers and their new kind of semi-professionalized allies who, after the demonstrations, gather to form groups, collective labs, research initiatives, etc. So I have numerous examples from my own experience doing interviews at both demonstrations and protest camps. So for example, when I was here in St. Petersburg in, I think, May 2012 at one of the protest camps, I was interviewing participants, and then someone approached me and said, "Oh, I hear that you're interviewing people. You know what, I wanted to tell you that I did a survey. I did an opinion poll here at the demonstration." I say, "Oh, so you're a sociologist, you're an opinion poll expert?" He says, no, I'm a computer programmer. And then he told me that, you know, he was an IT specialist from a small town in northwestern Russia who had been living in St. Petersburg for a while, and he had started frequenting this protest camp, spent a few nights there, and he became extremely curious about what was actually happening in that space. So just, you know, without any prior experience, he drew up a questionnaire and distributed it to over 100 people. And I asked, "So can I see this questionnaire or the results?" And he said, "No, you know, I threw this all away. I was just interested in sort of the general results," which, according to him, were that there are very different people here from very different backgrounds, and nobody wants a leader. Those are the kind of two things that for him came out of this opinion poll. In Moscow at the famous March of Millions on the 6th of May 2012, we interviewed a woman in her 60s who said that she had worked at a post office for several years because for her she had a very low income, and for her this was the only way that she could gain access to a large range of newspapers because they were distributed through the post office, and through reading all these newspapers she could get an idea of the entire political spectrum in Russia because she felt that just by watching TV she couldn't get an idea of what was actually going on. In Челябинsk in September 2012, one of the people I interviewed at the demonstration there was an unemployed engineer in his 40s who said that he came to this demonstration not because of any sort of political impulse of his own, but because he wanted to see who's there. And that's something that again and again I encountered in the interviews. People came to the demonstrations and remained at the demonstrations out of a very strong sentiment of curiosity. And also systematically, and this is something that I heard from many other colleagues, when I was interviewing protest participants, they would ask me to share the results of my research so far. So that was almost always the first kind of counter question when I started asking my questions. So can you tell me what you've already found or what your colleagues have found? Are there websites that we could look at? Are there publications that we could read? Because we want to know what's happening. So, you know, people go to the demonstrations to see who else is there, and then one of the reasons why they stop going is that either they stop meeting new people there, or they have the feeling that they stop meeting new people, or that they get the impression that they have learned what they could learn from the demonstrations, and they're now looking for new ways of sort of enhancing their knowledge about society and about politically active portions of that society. So the cognitive dimension seems to be extremely important, and this of course goes beyond the Russian case, and one could name numerous examples from, I don't know, 1968 in Germany, which has also spawned numerous research initiatives and archives, etc., and many other countries, of course. And I think this is perhaps often overlooked in the literature precisely because the emotionality that accompanies cognition is often suppressed or relegated to the anecdotal margins of writing by those who engage in the study of protests professionally. So very often this will be mentioned briefly in the introduction. You know, I was so excited when I first went to a demonstration related to this movement, and then it's kind of suppressed, and we continue with a sort of dry quantitative or qualitative data. So let me stop here for a second and turn to the affective dimension. So among Russian observers, comments on the emotionality of protest have mostly drawn on what emotion studies scholars call a hydraulic theory of emotions, which assumes that frustration builds up under pressure and can be released in cathartic moments such as demonstrations. And this is very obvious in the extremely popular text of, for example, the psychologist and blogger Lyudmila Petranovskaya, I think is her name, who stresses the contrast between the friendly and open atmosphere at the demonstrations and the general aggressiveness of everyday interaction in Russia. So for her, people come to the demonstrations in order to sort of release their pent-up frustrations and then feel this kind of warmth and nice, friendly atmosphere of being among people who share the same feelings. And in the scholarly literature, emotions at protests have often been studied as emotional breaching events, so as moments of overcoming individual pre-existing emotions, such as fear, or as moments that channel and amplify pre-existing emotions, such as anger. So people look at these contextual emotions that respondents at the demonstrations, for example, say they had felt before coming and that were part of their motivation for coming or for not coming, and then they try to see what happens with these emotions at the demonstration. So all of this is, of course, true and very valid and useful, but to me it tends to obscure the fact that neither individuals nor societies ever experience just one single emotion, which once again should be a very obvious point. There's always what I would call a political economy of emotions, and indeed perhaps an emotional regime. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to outlaw any single emotion. Even totalitarian regimes have probably never succeeded in doing that. But one can ban the displays of certain emotions from certain spaces, particularly the most public places, such as central streets and squares on the one hand, and TV broadcasts on the other hand. And I think this brings us to something that has been happening in Russia. So, and it's something that the Soviet and Russian authorities, of course, have been aware of for a very long time. Even Soviet social psychology, from its beginnings in the mid-60s, began to focus on something it called public moods, because there was this idea that one can no longer control the population focusing simply on behavioral and class aspects. One has to talk about moods. And Parygin, one of the late founders of social psychology here in St. Petersburg, wrote a very influential book on this in, I think, 1966, which is called Общественное настроение, public mood. I would argue that it is only by acknowledging these emotional regimes that we can really understand what appears to us in hindsight as clear cutoff dates between different eras, for example, between the Yeltsin and Putin eras. So if you look merely at, for example, indicators of social and economic change, they never precisely coincide with changes in government. You know, you cannot say that on the 1st of January, when a new president came into power, the living conditions of everyone in the country immediately changed. And yet, people have a very strong shared feeling in many of these cases that there is something that happened almost overnight. And there is an immediate change in mood. And this is something that's very explicitly captured by those who try to steer these moods. So if you think back to Yeltsin's abdication speech when he left the presidency in his New Year's Eve address, the last words that he said were, "Be happy, you deserve it." So, you know, he was trying to kind of induce a new public mood. In this vein, I would argue that the similarities between, for example, the Brezhnev and Putin eras that have often been remarked upon are not only and not even primarily due to similarities in socioeconomic developments, but they have to do with similarities that are often called stylistic, but which I would call similarities in emotional regimes. So the most public spaces are once again reserved for displays of positive emotions of certain kinds, such as national pride, belief in the success of the country, trust in the leader, etc. Or, on the other hand, expressions of hatred and irony towards purported enemies of the state. And, you know, here we can think of Nashi and all the sort of televised, mobilizing events that Russian TV has been full of under Putin. But other emotions, of course, are not outlawed altogether, but they're heavily censored and they're channeled into more private settings, which is why a lot of people and a lot of activists that one interviews will tell you, well, you know, just like in the 70s, before 2011, we found ourselves back in our kitchens discussing politics, or for people who can afford it, in cafes, which have, you know, a relatively high cost of entry because you actually have to be able to pay to go to them. Yeah? So public space is segmented, segregated, and access is restricted, and the most kind of ostensibly public layer of public space suppresses the expression of certain emotions. Irony directed at those in power, for example, or expressions of disgust with the political situation, became taboo immediately in the first weeks of when Putin came to power. And I have wonderful examples from Челябинsk, which was my main case study for the book, where literally at the beginning of 2000, first of all, there was an explosion of sort of public admiration of Putin. So for some reason, people have remarked on this, for some reason, Челябinsk became the national capital of Putin loving. Where people would grow tomatoes named after Putin. They would grow, I don't know, some people created a restaurant named after Putin with 7-part shashliks where every piece of meat stood for one of the federal districts, which was then outlawed very quickly by the authorities because it was seen as possibly ironic or critical, even though it hadn't been intended that way by the creators. And some of you may remember this. There was a famous anthem to Putin written by, I think, a law student from Челябинsk in early 2000, which was commented upon very ironically and critically by a German journalist who was at the time a correspondent in Moscow. And the student sued him for daring to criticize this poem or song. And so it was very interesting to me to observe when I was in Челябинsk last year to see that even in the very, very small, restricted and limited protest scene in Челябинsk, there was a kind of emotional explosion with these first demonstrations that continued into the end of 2012, where people were really consciously trying to establish something like an emotional counter-regime. So the situation that I described under Putin, of course, leads to very strong cynicism. And this is something that's also been discussed very frequently. Gudkov writes quite a lot about this using poll data where, for example, people say, well, you know, the main motivation behind the acts of suicide bombers is that they're being paid, which, if you think of it, is completely paradoxical, but a majority of those polled in Russia will agree with this. And there are many other examples of cynicism, which is not the kind of sincere cynicism that Artyom mentioned today, but it's a kind of cynicism where people understand that certain emotions and certain expectations about motivation are present and widespread, but they're not allowed, their expression is not allowed in public. So the question to me becomes, is it possible in a country like Russia to make emotional counter-regimes actually spread from below, so to change the political economy of emotions from below rather than as an imposition from above? And just to end, I want to show you a video that many of you, I'm sure, have seen, which was shown among other venues on a TV channel which tags itself as the optimistic channel, namely Дождь, and which in its PR and its whole sort of campaign since its very creation uses the language of emotion and the names of specific emotions very, very heavily to kind of create a brand for itself. So this was a video, sorry, oh no, it's here. Can I connect this? Which was created by the people who organized the elections to the Coordinating Council of the Russian Opposition last year, and which, as I said, was broadcast on Дождь and other channels. Can you see anything? Yeah.
need some time.
I'll tell you at the end what it's about. So this starts out with slogans that were relatively prominent in the first months of the demonstrations. Yeah. And then it goes on to display the names of individual emotions, such as fear, etc. And then it goes on into sort of optimism and future, etc., etc. So what I find very interesting about this is that, in a sense, it does exactly what the Russian authorities have been very successful in doing, namely sort of trying to orchestrate a certain emotional regime from above. And it tries to kind of create maybe a counter-emotional regime, but it would be difficult to say that this is an attempt from below, because this is, of course, a TV channel that's owned by a wealthy and successful business person. And it's watched mostly by people who have a relatively high level of income. And, you know, it's a commercial channel. So the question to me becomes, and actually the results of the emotions that they're showing, last sentence, are very similar to the emotions that Putin supporters are trying to orchestrate. Namely, it's optimism, it's belief in our leaders, in our future, and in our own sort of capacity to change the future. So the question for me becomes, are these the only options that we have? Do we need to use essentially TV and similarly centralized media in order to create emotional regimes and counter regimes? Or is there actually a way through the demonstrations, through occupying space, of doing so? So, be interested in hearing what you have to say.
I wanted to ask you, I haven't heard it mentioned here at all, but just before coming to Russia, I saw a very interesting video, at least I thought it was, and tell me if my interpretation of this video is right or wrong, called Proputинskие. You know this video is made by
it's a film, it's a documentary film.
Filmmakers, yes, and it's the story of this young woman who became a leader of Nashi at 16, and eventually kind of, through emotion, the emotion, cognition and emotion, meeting journalists who have been persecuted, and eventually, very courageously, I thought, is kind of leading the movement, semi-publicly because it's on video. I saw her a little bit as a hero a la Hannah Arendt, but maybe I'm wrong. I thought maybe...
Yeah, this is about Masha Drokova, who came from Tambov and became one of the federal leaders of Nashi, and then was friends with Kashin, and after Kashin was beaten up, she kind of left the movement, but now she works for the investment company that invests in Skolkovo, so she's not an opposition activist. Yeah, I mean, that is an example. What I found especially interesting about this film, which I saw again just less than a week ago, is that the methods that are used at the Nashi, or that were used at the Nashi gatherings, are actually very similar to what these people are trying to do with the video. So it's not at all a kind of Soviet or Hitlerjugend style attempt at mobilization. It's extremely modern and capitalist and individualistic. So they're trying to focus on the individual and the individual's kind of self-exploitation on the path to success, and having to overcome the obstacles of all these enemies that are out there to destroy our country, Putin, and the individuals present. And that seems to be the sort of the main path of creating emotional regimes that's prevalent in Russia nowadays. And once people leave that, as in this example of Drokova, they basically, drop out of the public view.
Yeah. Did you think it took courage for her to be in this movie?
Well, they started filming the movie before she decided to leave. So they wanted to just do a documentary about a typical representative of Nashi, and then while they were filming it, which the director was very lucky in that sense, all these things happened, and she became disillusioned and disappointed. So I don't know her personal situation well enough to.
No, I'm talking about a person who, in the Russian context, says this movement is wrong. I made a mistake. I'm leaving. What is your personal opinion of this person as a citizen?
That's become relatively common, and actually a number of relatively prominent protest organizers and even organizers of the so-called extra-parliamentary opposition movements started out their political careers as activists in pro-Putin movements. So that's a relatively common path to politicization, I would argue.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's extremely interesting presentation, and I think you stressed this importance of emotion. I agree with you that after this so-called emotional turn, it became more important to study this emotional dimension of protest movement. But from my own perspective, as I attended many meetings, protest rallies and so on, Petersburg particularly, I have a strong reservation against the sense of emotional bond among meeting participants. In many cases, even in the protest against this is a famous, emotionally actually, and culturally motivated protest against Gazprom Tower, during these rallies and meetings, I mentioned as camps. I mentioned that people was standing alone, without conversation with his neighbors. It was extremely, it strikes me very much because in my years I was organizing as a student, Komsomol organizer, these famous November demonstrations and May demonstrations. I quite well remember that how it was emotionally bonded, these people in this student, at least in the student group of demonstration participants. We spoke together, we have spoke together and singing and so on. In many demonstrations, even just I asked about Pushkin because I attended this meeting in Pushkin, this was maybe months ago, very emotionally grounded protest against the construction of huge new town, the so-called Yuzhny town. But it gathered about 300 people, but standing alone again. Only I identified several small circles of people speaking together. It was exactly people from neighborhood. Old woman. Yes, my question is that I'm very. So I think we have a phenomenon in our protest movement. In this of lonely crowd. Actually, it's very complex issue. So, and I think it is how to explain it. Maybe this theory of atomization can explain. Maybe we have taken into account this situation of emotional regime of fragmented population without this sense of we have to speak together. But that is a problem. I see it. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, which is why I try to be careful not to say that the main feature of this new emotional counter regime is that people feel a sense of unity. I don't think that's the case, or certainly not across the board. I would rather say that these spaces of the demonstration become spaces where people are, even if they remain isolated from each other, they feel free to voice and express emotions that otherwise, standing in the very same space, they wouldn't feel free to express. And in a sense, I think this video shows this in interesting ways, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to film these individuals holding up names of emotions in front of well-known landmarks, or in well-known sites like Bolotne, but which in this video are completely empty of other people. Right? So the idea is that the individual can occupy space that is otherwise considered public and is now free to express certain emotions which otherwise that individual wouldn't be free to express. So it's not about a feeling of unity. No?
emotional expressions. If people does not speak together, and only standing and listening to leader, to speaker during this demonstration or meeting, what constitutes emotional regime? Only faces with happy.
No, I mean, first of all, it's not entirely true that people never talk to each other. So I would say that for a lot of people, especially a lot of people that I interviewed, the experience of going there and being able to talk to people they hadn't previously known was a very important part of that experience. And also, if you think of the way, and people have written about this, the way that the space is organized. So for the first time, people find themselves in a large crowd without internal policing. Right? So the entire kind of the policing happens around the crowd. So it's very difficult to get in because there are only one or two spots where you can actually cross the metal detectors to enter that space of the demonstration. But once you're inside, at least until the police come barging in and beating you up, you feel a kind of freedom and in a sense safety from censorship. So that makes you feel free to express. And what happened in Челябинsk was that one of the people I interviewed for the book came back from the March of Millions in Moscow and learned about the Occupy Abay camp in Moscow and started something similar in Челябинsk where for a month people would meet not round the clock but every single evening in the central square of Челябинsk to just talk and get to know each other. And to them, that was the main point of what they were doing.